Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Recording. Welcome everyone to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire for us to gather and cohere at the knife's edge of what's happening now. And today we are joined by Cadell Last, Kevin Orosz, and Daniel Dick, the authors of this book right here, Sex, Masculinity, God, the Trialogues, where they engage in a series of trialogues with one another to, I would say, explore how to come into right relationship with these infinitely vast topics. And it takes the reader on a sort of journey and having that, being in that dialogue with them, asking the questions, responding, endeavoring to come into right relationship yourself or myself, speaking from my personal experience. And so today I'm going to start by asking them a question and then invite everyone here to share your questions in the chat. I will call on you to ask your question. And this is round two, actually. So the first time I had a wonderful time. We had a lot of really good questions, so we had to bring it back for a second round. So thank you, Cadell, Kevin, and Daniel for being here today for a second round.
Thanks for having us. It's fantastic to be back.
Good. All right, so the question that was bubbling up for me really shortly actually after I woke up this morning is around my interest in this emerging network of smart villages or proto-bees. So communities, places of living where we can experiment with what a game bee society, way of living might look like. And so my hope is that there is a sort of golden age of intentional communities that is emerging. And so my curiosity lies in, as I look at intentional communities historically, both successful and unsuccessful, there's often been an emphasis on agreements around sexuality. And in some cases, strong limitations. And then in other cases, agreements around like radical openness and inclusivity. And so my curiosity lies in what might agreements in a healthy, intentional community or proto-bee look like to explore, well, maybe, what might agreements look like? To what extent are limitations in those communities useful, or to what extent are they to be transcended and not imposed, or how to think about that question in a better way? How might these intentional communities, these proto-bees, approach this this topic, and where do you see those agreements being and lying, and or are there any? Is it allowed for organic emergence? It's something that I was wondering about, considering. So I feel a sort of tempted to want to crystallize really my question super clear, but I think that you could pick up on that.
Sure. Really good question, really deep question. And it brings us right to maybe some of the most difficult things to think intellectually. I can just preface it sort of by saying that I remember before I had finished my PhD that I had this image that when I had gotten my PhD, I would have somehow mastered something. But I remember when I was getting my PhD on the day, my relationship life was a mess. My sexual life was a mess. And I couldn't have felt more unmasterful of my life. And I think that is a good metaphor for the way we're educated in general, is really we don't have anything close to what should be sexual education. We get shown how to put, this ridiculous archetypal example of putting a condom on a banana as like sex education. Like we learn about, the physics and the biology of sex, but we don't learn anything about the emotional depths of sexuality and just how essential sexuality is for our identity. And, to be honest, about how incredibly dark and paradoxical sexuality can be. So let me tell this story, which is hopefully a good example of where I would sort of start to approach this problem of intentional communities and sexuality, which is that we should never underestimate the subject of the unconscious, and in order to, which really makes intention problematic. So the subject of the unconscious makes intention problematic. Let me give an example of what I mean by that. The first time I masturbated, like 12, 13 years old, what I say is, looking back on the actual act, was that my body masturbated me. I didn't masturbate, my body masturbated me. I didn't even know what I was doing. I was like, oh, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? Oh, and then interesting, what happens immediately after my first time doing, for some reason, this is the mystery of sexuality for me. For some reason, I immediately knew, don't tell anyone. I immediately knew, you can't tell your mom about this. Like, why is sexuality like this? Why is it that it's so difficult to bring knowledge and sexuality into a harmonious relation? I think the problem goes deeper than just mere socialization, although the socialization and the education play a role. But it makes it incredibly difficult to form an intentional community with rules and norms about sexuality when basically everyone is in this situation of being a split subject, with the unconscious of sexuality being so foreign to our intellect. And, in my experience, just in recent weeks with running a men's circle and talking about sexuality, the problem is universal. All the men I speak with when they open up about their sexuality is that they form families which are primordially based on a sexual act, which is that, of course, you meet a woman, you sexually attracted to the woman, you mess around, you eventually have kids, you form a family. And what they find after decades of being married is that they actually cannot talk about sexuality at all. And the fact is that the sexual act is what founded their community or their family. So the problem is what I'm trying to say is that the problem is so deep, and we cannot just give simple answers about how to form an intentional community, what the rules or regulations about sexuality would be, because the problem is so deep that we really have to go back to first principles, and we really have to be totally open in our identities to the level at which we don't know. That's where I would say as a starting point. I hope that's not a romantic answer. But I'll throw that to you, Kevin.
Yeah, Cadell, love the thesis, brother. Definitely not a romantic answer, but an important question. Why is sexuality the taboo? Like, even more, I think, than God or manhood, right? That we deal with 3 big taboos in our book. And which, by the way, I'm so grateful to see all these faces here. Definitely see some new faces from last time. Welcome. Sex is the biggest taboo. There's no bigger taboo. Even in Genesis, which is, I always bring this up because it's just, I think most of us are Western. Even in Genesis, there's a sexual taboo, where part of like becoming godlike, becoming like Yahweh and eating of the fruit is they cover their genitals. Like, there's so many big issues in that story that are this coding for Western civilization, and that's in there. The shame around the body is in there. And so where I want to take this question and steer it, and I know we have so much to get into here, but I want to bring it more practical and experiential. And building off what Cadell said, why is the sexual act, so unconsciously driven? Because it often finds itself at odds with the society, with leadership, with structure, with the church. The church has been the primordial enemy of sexuality, right? Preaching celibacy, preaching you'll go to hell if you have sex before marriage. And I have firsthand experience of that, being raised Catholic, and for part of my teens buying into that at great personal cost. So the core thing here is the community, which is a bunch of cells, humans, that are forming a body or an organ system, is a perfect metaphor for our actual bodies, which are sexual bodies. These bodies are sexual, and there's no way around it. And in fact, it's where we all come from. So therefore, sexuality must be something good. Nature favors sexuality greatly. Why are there more nerve endings in the clitoris or on the penis than anywhere else in the body? Nature doesn't make mistakes. So that has to be at the foundation of any successful community, is not shaming the body, understanding its primacy, and having healthy, open awareness and knowledge around the body. Now, to zoom in a little more, and I'll share a little bit of my limited but very rich experience living in intentional communities, not for very long, only about a couple months max at a time, but having been in the retreat and workshop world heavily, which forms like a baby intentional community for up to a week or two, and having actually lived on things like permaculture farms, which are running communities, sexuality is very much at the forefront. On one hand, you have very strict enforcement that kind of works just like normal society. Couples come in together, they stay together. Single people might date, they might not. But it's kind of like unspoken, hey, we're going to do this like outside the community. Those communities are successful, stable. Many of them still fall prey to the same issues as normal society: repression, shame, guilt, blame, infidelity, etc. Now, the other type of community, which I've had much less experience with, is, I think Tamara in Portugal is the best example. It celebrates polyamory, or let's say non-monogamy styles. And this presents a beautiful opening because a lot of people feel less shame, they feel more free. There's ability for the whole community to kind of witness and meet any contractions that happen from certain pair bonds, because there's so many and they're so multivariable. And this also presents a massive issue because when money is also involved, when the day-to-day duties of a community are also involved, and so-and-so is sleeping with so-and-so, but she's also sleeping with so-and-so and so-and-so, and so-and-so and so-and-so have to collaborate on a project or task, or there has to be forward momentum on the financial, structural, organizational, leadership level, etc. This presents massive problems. And I know people that have lived in these situations, experienced non-monogamy that completely ruined relationships. I've also heard the other side where it completely strengthened relationships and got them out of the way of their own bullshit. But I'll throw to you with this, Daniel. I haven't seen a model. I don't know of a model. I imagine our ancestors had something like this, because they definitely weren't Catholics, but they also just weren't like in orgies all the time, at least most of our ancestors. How can we still create a community in Game B that is productive, efficient, and resourceful while not shaming the body or sexuality? And I think that question has yet to be answered in any use case, right? So I'll pass to you, Daniel.
Okay, here we go. A lot of things on the plate. Where to start? First of all, a big about rules. We'll start there. Rules make sense by exceeding a number of a good number without rules is 12 people. Everything that exceeds that needs more time to communicate and to agree on. And if you exceed 35 people, you have to have kind of two groups that has to coordinate somehow to each other so that you can talk about everything that emergence can survive without any rules. So that is a very simple calculation of a day-to-day thing, is because the amount of information that you can speak is limited to the way that you can organize a group of people so that everybody gets to listen. So it is also from the hunter and gatherers, it is like the number where they split. It is also in sociocracy and holocracy and stuff like that. You can see, okay, there's a certain number that you can't exceed communication on organization. And when it comes to sexuality, I mean, one thing is about the big issue that we are dealing here is actually infidelity. What is that? What actually is infidelity? Trust. Usually infidelity comes up when trust is broken. And we have rejection, because someone is maybe having sex with someone else. So the big question here, why are these feelings arising? What kind of feelings, why these feelings come up? And I think there is a part that is about, because in our societies, sexuality is lived private, behind the doors. By hunter and gatherers, they would have sex just in the camp, so everybody would know who is with whom. Some would like go a bit more far away, but it's kind of like more transparent. And on one hand, we have like this dichotomy about intimacy and transparency. And that is the same dichotomy that we have that when we talk about sex, so that what is intimate, is being exposed. So usually what happens is that that you have a kind of a bond between the person that you have sex. You also have a bond between the people that you have a community with. So the betrayal and the infidelity goes out of this bond. And this has several consequences. One consequence is like it changes the structure of the bond, for some bad and for some good. The first reaction is rejection from the one that got out of the bond, as well as the one that is like in this bond. I can't describe it better as a bond right now, but it's like a nucleus, to say, or maybe a kind of oneness, an entity that has a different level. And this is due to a partnership as well as to a community. So when you break the frontiers of this entity, it is rejection and it is infidelity. But the feeling that comes with that is that you destroyed something that is actually intimate, taboo. And the point is that what is intimate and what is taboo is also what is sacred. And what is sacred and what is taboo is sacred because it is the reason for this entity to come together. And the big point about that actually there is no reason. And that's why there is no talking about it. And that is also why it is sacred. So this is kind of the inherent nature. And when it comes to the problem of feeling rejection, is like, are you able to just go into this void of no reason, That is actually the question. And can you hold this in your community? Or can you hold this in your partnership? Yeah. And this is a big drive, you know, if you can have this tension in the community, in your partnership, that there's no reason is filled with trust. Because there is no reason to trust. Trust is always a decision. Like, so much on our world is built on trust. Like, we trust that the link works. We trust that the money is something worth. So the trust that we have in the nucleus of a partnership, and especially then in a community, is on a high concentration, because the distribution of trust is very based on one person, so that the wish to that the projection or the wishes are fulfilled are very concentrated to one person or by one community. In which society, in our societies, we have tons of friends and tons of connections, so that the risk of losing trust into someone is distributed. And this is also something very important for communities, and that's how hunt and gather communities work quite well, that you don't have to stick together. There's always another community to go to. You know? So there's maybe discomfort also because of losing the partner and so on. But the problem arises really if you have this attachment to the group, because there is so much on the stake, or there's all the attachment to the partner because everything is on stake to that community, to that partner, that it would be like the life-fulfilling thing. And yeah, I mean, detachment and trust, if they go like both in hand, it's a big thing to really live it. Yeah, but yeah, communication is always a key in that. And I want to say one thing, Alicia, good to see you here. She was the one that did the illustrations of our book. So, and they have been so nice. So I want to say hello on that side. And yeah, I keep it for here. There are coming a lot of questions already.
Excellent. Yes, there are. Thank you. David, would you like to start us off and ask your question?
Yeah, I guess I will. I managed to put mine in there right away, but I'm kind of going back to where the question was up there on the. Yeah, I'll just read it. I have a lot of questions around this area, and every time somebody speaks, they bring up another piece that I want to know more about. And I really liked what Daniel was talking about, because it was really filling in a lot of pieces. So my question is, so I've seen a lot of men here, and so as a small sample of men, I also want to acknowledge the women being here. So thank you for being here. I don't want to just pretend that you're not here. But of the many men that are here, my assumption is that we're asking ourselves about masculinity. We're using that word, and I'm wondering if it's necessary for us to break the role open. In other words, when we use the word masculinity, it's we learned what masculinity was by our environment. And so when we're trying to discover ourselves, this role of masculinity, just the language, makes it more difficult for us to find our true selves and to find our true desires and be more authentic. So I guess my question is the utility of using the word masculinity helpful? Does it tend to make it more difficult for us to find our sexuality and the roles that we want to play in partnership or in relationship with women, if we're constantly referring back to the images of masculinity, is that going to get in our way? The game B for me is about self-actualization as the primary goal of purpose in a new society. The previous game of A was wealth and status and power. So that probably would trigger some comments from somebody here.
Sure. Thanks for your question, David. Well, the first, I mean, I don't think power is going anywhere. Power can change. Power can be expressed differently than status and money. But I ultimately agree with what you're saying about the distinction between game A and game B. In terms of gender and whether gender is useful or not, I think if the images of masculinity are getting in the way of your true self, that's not good. So the desire and the truth of your desire should lead, and the usefulness in the images that you construct around that should follow. Otherwise, you're putting yourself in a cage which is not matched to your desire. You're just trapping yourself into an image which might be like the image of the normative standards of society, what they think of what masculinity is or what they think about femininity is, and that's just getting separated from yourself even deeper. But let's take it back to the foundations. Like, let's go back to the foundations, and let's not even use the words masculine and feminine just yet. So when we say, like, for example, in psychoanalysis, Freud said the concepts of masculine and feminine are some of the most confused words in all of science. And they remain some of the most confused words in all of science. So when Freud talks about libido and links libido to a masculine principle, what he's really saying is that libido is the active, energetic principle. So it's activity, basically. We don't even need to use the word masculinity, just this word activity. And what femininity is kind of the opposite. As metaphysically in the ancient world, it was the active, passive principles. Now we can get into paradoxes with this active and passive principles, but what I want to suggest, and what emerged from later psychoanalytic theory, is the idea that what we call masculinity is kind of like a active pushing in, and what we call femininity is a passive receiving in. This basic motion of a going in or a being in is then what we build images of masculine and feminine around. So like the most alpha male is the one who can go in whenever he wants, or the most feminine, beautiful woman can receive in any phallic penetration. Now, these are the absurd extremes of these images. But what we're talking about basically when we're talking about deep intimacy with others, we have bodies. We're minds and a body, and we're interrelating our bodies in a certain way. Like for me, for example, like what do I mean when I say I'm masculine and I identify as masculine is in the sexual act itself. For me, if someone was to go in me, this for me is traumatizing. In order for me to receive in, I personally can't do. That means that I take that as my not disconnection, but my expression of self is on a far end of a spectrum of what we call masculine in terms, I can't receive in like that. So, but this is not tied to the body. So for example, there are what I would call subjects in a male body who are naturally receiving in. Now that could be biologically, that could be culturally, that could be socially, it could be in a number of ways. But there's this passive receiving in, whereas there are many subjects who appear in a female body who naturally express more outwards, and this can change developmentally, it can change socially, it can change relationally. So you could be someone who relates very masculine way to someone at one time in your life, and then you could respond very feminine way to another subject at a different time in your life. So these things are more fluid and less fixed than we think, and they're definitely not fixed to the biological bodies we appear in. The biological bodies we appear in condition a certain mode of action. Like, so for example, the fact that I have a penis conditions my subjectivity in a different way than if I was born with a vagina. It just conditions my subjectivity differently. My experience of being in a body is different. So that would be the start of my conversation for basically putting the authentic desires and expressions of the self before gender identification. The gender identification should follow from whatever it is you're exploring in your own authentic expression of body energy. And I'll pass it to Kevin. Hopefully that's a helpful answer.
Yeah, nailed it. I mean, a lot is said. I'll make it quick. I mean, David, I love this question. It's an interesting one. When you ask what is the utility of referring to gender when we want to be authentic, I agree with a lot of what Cadell said, and try it the other way. Just try it, and then you'll find the utility pretty quickly with how your confidence, productivity, actualization of desire is manifesting. If it's manifesting, great. Maybe it's time to discard some of the identification. If it's not manifesting, might be time to try something else. And I personally disagree with Cadell a little bit here, and maybe some others of you. I think there is massive utility in referring to gender, right? And it doesn't matter what gender you are. Like I fully think that the LGBTQ plus trans community has tons of legitimate ways they can express their deeper selves. But for most people, most of the time, identifying somewhat loosely, not rigidly, but using the utility of masculinity as the principle, I can only speak for myself, produces high utility. And I used to be in resistance to this and was like, well, I'm going to be in my feminine now. And this was early on the spiritual path, doing a lot of yoga, going vegetarian. I went on this whole bender of spirituality and manifesting that way. And I thought that being more feminine as a man made me more attractive to women. It made me more spiritual, more enlightened, blah, blah, blah. We've probably heard this rap before. And utility of that was almost zero for me. It was only after actualizing masculine principles of discipline, of discernment, of assertion, which to some people looks like aggression, but becoming highly assertive had massive utility. And my business, my relationship with women, my physical body, my mood, all became 10x. So, and that's another very simple reason. I'll go back to nature and our ancestors. The template of masculinity and the template of femininity is extremely powerful. It's an archetype, and it's utilitarian. It's very utility based. And I think with personal experimentation, you can find out what that degree is, because it's going to be different for everyone. But you can imagine your father and your father's father and his father, and just go back down the line. And you can imagine the utility they had to exert to raise a family and exist in a world of hostile forces, both economic and violent. And I believe the masculine utility, to just focus on that, the feminine utility I can't speak to because I don't utilize it as much as I utilize the masculine, but I imagine it's a similar argument. The masculine utility is massive. And I believe, to kind of zoom out into the world and looking at the chaos in the world is in a large part due to an absence of positive masculine utility. And so I don't think it's time to discard it. I think it's time to step into it fully, not using, and this is the important kicker here to this whole spiel I'm on, not using the toxic imagery produced by our culture. Because the imagery around masculine utility in our culture, speaking to those gay male dynamics, is completely fucked. And a child can recognize that. The machismo and death worship and chauvinism and economic just excess and just brutality that we see in the world from masculine, actors and agents is because of the culture's values are just lost. So we're in an interesting time where we get to reinvent them, and masculinity is certainly involved in that. So I pass to you, Daniel.
Definitely, thank you. I mean, what comes up for me is like, if we use masculinity, it is always like opposing something that you're not. And that where the utility comes into place is acknowledgement of that you're not everything, you know, like this is really this acknowledgement to say, okay, I'm just only a part of this game, you know, I'm not the whole bakery, I'm just the cake, you know. So there is a part that keeps you so humble, you know. And in that case, I used to think in the last centuries, it like in the last 2 centuries, where we're like mixing everything a bit up because women got like jobs that man had, and so men are kind of disoriented because we don't know what to do because we don't have this clear difference to women. So we're now talking more about these energies that both of us have inside of us, and we try to balance that inside ourselves and also with our relationships. And it became like our society very individual. What is actually masculine for us, or what is feminine for us, and how we define ourselves through the attraction and the desire that we can feel for someone else. And I see that, I mean, there it comes like this self-actualization into place, where we say, okay, we don't have any social cultural rules anymore to follow because everything got like kind of a mess. So the only thing that we can really rely on is myself and my experience to my world. And this uncertainty is something that is to play it out in these times. And usually it is also like a tipping point to another more structural way in societies. So it is really a way how to define, but we have at the time right now really to define a new masculinity, because we had a new feminism, like or femininity, but not really a new masculinity, and all the shadows and toxic ways we were seeing right now. So it is really the time to define a new masculinity and what the healthy looked like. And what I can pick up here is also like there is something that we are kind of like more merging into a feminine space as before, like the ability to go inward, the ability to acknowledge feelings and so on. I think that's a big part where the man can do it also on their way, you know. Usually the masculine will be like, okay, I'm sitting in silence and go into these feelings, and then I come out of my cave, you know. But feelings, for example, have to not really addressed. So this is something where I can see like a new masculinity can be healthy, because otherwise aggression takes over and it's not productive anymore. So from that point of view, it is on one hand the acknowledgement to be a part of something that you're not, and acknowledge that you're not that, you know, and say, okay, but I'm fine with what I am, and I'm insufficient to really make this life circles rolling. And this is actually where it comes into your feeling. And when it comes to sexuality, it is about what you desire, what you're attracted to. And this is your opposite, which leads to your unconscious of what you're heading to next to reveal to your conscious. So I keep it from there, because on one hand, I think there are so many other questions that are popping up right now.
David, did you have a follow-up comment there?
Yeah, I appreciate everybody's comments. There was some that I disagreed with, but mainly, Cadell, I wanted to thank you for that description of masculinity, which is a lot easier for me to accept. The older model imagery that I have. But what I wanted to say, because of that imagery you had that you gave about that, my feeling is that allowing in part, that feminine part, is easier to accept. It's easier to do. It's the essential part that most men can't do and are afraid to do. And I really appreciate you kind of helping me to get this picture. Thank you, guys.
No problem. I totally agree with you.
Excellent. Okay. I have a question, and I want to read Chup's, just the first couple sentences of their comment here, which is, I'm not sure about this new masculinity thing. It's like the claim that we need a new narrative. And they go on and then they expand on their question. And so I was just thinking a moment ago about, so we're talking about models for masculinity and our cultural representations of the masculine man and how they are flawed. And thinking about this, the first thing that comes up is like the political sphere in the United States and those metaphors. And I think about how in my relationships, I'm aware of people starting sort of calling for figures like The Rock or Jocko Willink to run for president. There's like this, you know, I start to sense that. And then I see Kanye West in his presidential bid, and he's sort of like the fool, like making a fun joke of it all, but also I think like invigorating that in ways, politics and just, yeah, being different, being creative, being imaginative, being playful. So I'm curious about this. Well, first of all, this idea, like we need a new narrative. People are sort of in the game B sphere sometimes talking about we need a new story, and how that relates to, you know, do we really need a new masculinity? What is it that like The Rock and Jocko are, or what is the significance of people starting to sense that and say things like we want The Rock or we want Jocko Willink? Can that happen? What would it take to get there? And like, what is the role of the fool, like Kanye, in changing the way that we relate to masculinity and specifically in leadership?
I love that question, Tyson. For me, like, and in the new work we're doing with Kevin and Daniel, for me, the masculine and the feminine are historically conditioned archetypes which are losing their meaning, and that when people hyper identify with masculinity or hyper identify with femininity, this is a trap, and it's a sign of extreme anxiety. It's a defense against anxiety, because the anxiety is more real than whatever you're identifying with. and anxiety is what is present before you identify. Now, when it comes to a positive project, okay, what would be my idea of a positive project other than the calling for new masculinity or new femininity? Is basically to explore androgynous otherness, however it appears authentically for you. But it doesn't need to be, I'm going to be either like in the red pill community, I'm either going to be the traditional man or I'm going to be the player, pickup artist. All of these are contradictory, very weak identities. They'll fall apart as soon as you put them into practice over a long course of time. It's better, I think, to just play with the potential otherness of your identity. And here, Kanye West is a fantastic example. So in recent Kanye West interview with Joe Rogan, he comes up with the idea that our life should be more like a video game, that it's not that we should all go into virtual world, go and play video games nonstop, or go into pornography or whatever it is that people do in the virtual world. It's that we should make our life more like a video game, meaning that we can play with identity. This is enlightenment. If you can play with identity, not too strongly attached, but just play with it in different contexts, this is really spiritual enlightenment to me, because gamify more, make society more interesting, and play with our identities more. Like, I always had the idea that, like, instead of having reality TV shows, we should use the principles of reality TV gaming to make more interesting social situations. Like, what happens when you go on a Survivor challenge? What happens when you go on a, whatever it is that we could come up with lots of interesting ideas, but to gamify our identities, let things emerge. So for me, the crucial thing is that whenever you have very strong identity, this is a defense against anxiety. And two, this prevents genuine emergence. In order to have genuine emergence of something different, I always say, I say something alien, something other, something that we can't think at the moment. In order to have this emerge, you have to be genuinely open. Genuinely open. And you can't be genuinely open if you're, I am this, you know, too self-confident in what you are. No, we don't know what we are. No one knows what they are. If anyone says, I am this, I know I am this, no, that's nonsense. I call nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, Kanye West may be the archetype of the fool. He's holding down the zero position in the tarot deck of celebrity personalities. And I think there's great utility in the fool. And what's interesting about the fool in the tarot, which is a library of archetypes, again, the fool is the starting point. So the fool has to emerge first. You have to be a beginner. You have to be a fool to embark on that quest of enlightenment or the presidency or whatever. And so there's actually great utility in that, and all men, all people will experience that at some point. Now, the danger is if you stay in the fool, you become a jester or a joker, and that's usually a chaotic force, often for ill, although sometimes for benevolent reasons as well. To go back to the question and circle back here, again, we're in a trap of language. New masculinity, third wave feminism, and new feminism. From my mind, and again, I'm looking across time at human history, what's been written down, most of it hasn't. I can't even imagine that this stuff is new. None of it's new. It's just that the society we're living in, and again, it's not society's fault. We don't have to go into the victim camp, but got to look at what's on the table, what's on the game board in front of us. Look at the chess pieces. The society is set up in a very toxic, malfunctional way. So we don't need to reinvent masculinity or femininity. We need to toss out toxic value systems. And a good place to look is probably to the past, to people's ancestors' systems that lived in harmony with each other, the earth, and the all, or God, whatever you want to name the spiritual dimension. That's a great place to look for something that looks like new masculinity. But it won't be new. It won't be like, oh, after reading Hegel and after analyzing Freud, and well, now we have Jocko Willink, we've created the new masculine. It's like, no. Why those people are getting gravitas, why someone would ever elect The Rock, why people are electing Trump, is because they're exuding a very assertive, dominant, hierarchical energy that we have been recognizing throughout all human history. And even animals recognize this. It's that quality of a leader, of a hero. Now, is Donald Trump a positive example of a real hero? Is Joe Biden, for that matter? No. They're a toxic absurdity. And anyone with half a brain, I think, knows that on one level. But someone brought up the limbic system. The limbic system and our emotional regulation and these deep parts of us are oriented at these beings because they have, across time, enabled civilization. They've enabled it. Strong male leadership has enabled massive growth. Say what you want about the patriarchy. In the distant past, perhaps there was a matriarchy where women ruled the world. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. However, right now, where we are in history, The Rock might have a chance at the presidency because of how starved people are for real masculine utility and power. Now, unfortunately, a lot of it's sourced in Wall Street and soaked in the blood of innocence and just completely fucked right now. That doesn't mean that we still don't need these driving forces moving forward. I don't think and this is completely metaphorical, and I'm just swinging for the fences here. a completely transgender entity, like imagine the most androgynous person you could imagine, they probably couldn't win the presidency in our current climate because the polarization is necessary right now at our stage. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It just seems to be the way it is. Should we seek to change that? Yes. Do I think that the new versions of masculinity and femininity will be inclusive of that? Yes, if they're healthy, I think so. That's all I got, Daniel.
Okay. So I wanna draw like an utopia, because I do think that things change and that things go on, and we have things that are absolutely not new. But what is new is like the amount of people that have access to it, because we are on a phase of the world in which civilizations had found each other to be connected through the whole world. And what we can know from tribesmen till whatever person, we can find it, we can access even the most secret teachings, they're all out there. And I think that this type of complexity that we have in our society is actually a very, it is a personal development, it is a spiritual development. And this development, even that's nothing new. It always goes from the unconscious to the conscious, from the instinctive, the animalistic, to being aware of it. And this movement, which is not something very, very, I mean, there is a cycle where we get like more conscious, but imagine if you really attain that level of consciousness, that you don't have anymore any unconscious desire. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine if sex wouldn't matter? Would there any selfish act on I need to have sex and reproduction? I don't know. But what I see in here, that the quantity of the people that have access to, like, all the people that are right now here, you're making yourself questions and thoughts about yourself and about masculinity and the world, and we are connected through the whole world in this platform. That is so unique to all the history that we know. That's really incredible. And some of the things that we are talking about has been like holding the secret teachings secretly, and we can talk openly about that. Somehow your interest, your desire to know this has led you here. So I think that we are on a point, and maybe it's also just our bubble that we are right now here, but it led us to really grasp on the root of the desire to transcend the unconscious to the conscious. And I think when this happens, there is always something that is more compassionate, that is always something more aware of the other than also just of oneself. So when the awareness of the other rises more than the need of what you need for yourself, we truly don't need that much regulations. That here I come to the very beginning. If there is like this true understanding of the other, because the other is not something unconscious, because you don't have a desire of the other, because if it would be a desire of the other, you would have something in the other unconscious. First of all, if we know that and we take it as a driving force to raise consciousness of oneself and the other, which is actually the other, and if that course would take us to be like more compassionate for the other, instead of the need of having a bound that we need to hide from other, then we definitely won't have our hierarchical system of a president that would need to be elected and to tell us how to behave, because our behavior would be ethical from the root, because we would have conscience about the other. And this is something, if you put like this personal development into communal development, also partnership development, it can be like a real, it can be really like overwhelming too, because you have to change and you have to grow. You have to go through pain and just let go your ego, which is the source of your desires. And if you can let go it totally, then you're free to really create and be with someone else without needing to really put yourself in place of, okay, but that's mine, and this is what I want only for me, like a partner, like a community, or like materials stuff. So that is like a very utopian view that I have, that we are on the scratch of making this broader accessible to the people. That's what I believe. And that is a very androgynous being, that it doesn't have any difference to itself. Yeah.
Thank you. In a discussion around collective decision making the other night, someone referenced indigenous cultures and a council of grandmothers as being an example of decision making. And I've heard Tyson Yacopoulos talk about in indigenous cultures, like women eventually as grandmothers start to grow beards and men start to grow breasts. And I was considering that as maybe the best example of an androgynous leader is a grandmother. Anyway, Fiona, I would like to go to your question if you would unmute and ask it.
Sure. So before, this is rewinding back now a bit, but Kevin was talking about overthrowing toxic societal ideas while holding on to more traditional concepts of masculinity and femininity. And I'm just wondering, there's a lot of idealism, in a lot of the ideas that have been expressed. And I just wonder, why not take a more radical view of reinventing these concepts and instead holding on to them?
Can I isolate the question? The last thing you said, could you re-emphasize? Re-emphasize the last part of your question? Sorry.
Yeah. So I'm wondering why would we hold on to old, ancient ideas of masculinity and femininity without any sort of restructuring process? Looking at feelings in the status quo. Evaluating how we feel today.
Okay. Yes, okay, I got your question. I totally agree with you. That's what I meant about, I'm skeptical of this strong identification with either masculine or feminine. It's a defense against anxiety. And I don't feel we know ourselves well enough to even know what we're talking about when we strongly identify with these categories. Like I'll go take it back to the first thing I was saying about, we don't even know what a sexual education would look like. Like, this is how ignorant we are about sexuality and sexual energy. Like, I feel like we have to work from the ground up. Like I've seen a lot of different documentaries now about the struggles that children and teenagers are having living in the digital age, and that they're experiencing emotions that adults don't even have words for. And that a lot of these things are about encountering knowledge of sexuality far earlier and in a far more extreme and I don't know, intense manifestation than anything previous generations have encountered. Like when I remember when I was a kid, back when I was a kid, like I was in a survey, and if one of my friends had a ripped out page from a Playboy, that would be like all I would ever see of sexuality. And now you have kids who have access to the internet, and they could just Google something and immediately they have access to all sorts of sexual imagery, basically an infinite amount of sexual imagery. And even the way people are using these apps, and the way people are using, kids and teenagers using these apps to express sexual identities, which are so out of line with their age, basically. So basically we're confronting a sexual landscape that is extremely new. It's never existed before. The adults don't know how to handle it because they don't know their own sexuality, so they can't give a sexual education. So I think that we have to start with the foundation, which is what you said, which is how we're feeling. And to me, the emotion that's truest and the emotion that is most helpful is probably the anxiety and the depression, but not from the point of view of medicalizing it, not from the point of view of trying to get rid of it, from the point of view of learning what it is, from the point of view of learning what it's saying. And it comes down to basically, why do we even have sex at all is the crucial point. And that's, to me, would be the starting point, is that I don't know if I have time to get into it really, but that's ultimately the question that we're going to be confronting in the coming decades, I believe. And the gender question of, am I a man? Am I a woman? Am I masculine? Am I feminine? These are ways in which the identity deals with the impossibility of sexuality in history, is all I could get into. But we could go deeper into it, but I'll pass it on to Kevin because I don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah, the comments are going off. So grateful for you all just going in right now with us. This is really exciting. I want to make a couple of things clear and be pretty quick. I love your question, Fee. And I guess to clarify, and again, I kind of got sound bites of my view here. And what I believe is that the toxic societal, just like what Cadell's just describing, like the pervasive pornography, the deep programming from Disney and Hollywood, the politicized version of the West. I'm an American, so we've gotten kind of the worst of it, although I hear that it's everywhere. And I am living abroad, so it is everywhere to some extent. Do I think that ancient societies were perfect and that I'm actually far more utilitarian? I think they worked things out in much healthier ways over time. And colonialism obviously decimated most of these people, although some still exist in Africa and the Amazon that are doing just fine with their old ways. Now they still have contact though, so they've still imported the t-shirts and iPhones. Now, why was that so? Why did some ancient concepts around masculine and feminine, which I'm making a lot of assumptions, to be fair, I'm not a cultural anthropologist, but I do notice this when I go into this information, when I speak to indigenous from South America, when I speak to indigenous from the American Southwest, who I've had the beauty of sitting in ceremony with some, it's like, they don't have it figured out either, but maybe because of Dunbar's number or their deep reverence for life and earth, they had better value systems. So that's what I'm proposing, is that we tear out these horrific value systems where 13-year-olds are watching porn and then expecting another 13-year-old to enact that. I mean, in what sick society would that happen? Well, I can think of one, and that is very late Rome, which was a cesspool of horrific, deviant, and brutal sexual practices. And that civilization got wiped off the map, and we all know what happened. And I think we're in an echo of that right now. And obviously it's very different. I'm not condemning the whole society. There's tons of positive movements, men's work being one example, women's work being another, where people are endeavoring to This group is a perfect example to confront the real of these unknowns around sexuality, heal the divide between masculine and feminine, and come to a way to relate that we can actually have a community that can witness and confront negativity around things like sexuality, around things like economics. And unfortunately, I don't see our current system working that way. Now, to close, and I think your point was legit, like, let's go a more radical way. Let's completely reinvent it based on the modern dilemma. And that's a yes and. It's quantum. Yeah, we're going to have to do that because we're facing problems, as Cadell was saying, that no one's ever faced. And where are you going to get the building blocks to build a life-giving system and value system for masculine and feminine? You're going to have to look deep into the genetic code, into the past. You're not going to be able to create ex nihilo. And that's where I think, archetype is a word that, it kind of encompasses so many things. I've used it a number of times tonight, but whatever you want to call that, these primordial patterns that have worked, they seem to be pre-existent in the human unconscious, those will be the building blocks for this radical revisioning. So it will be a both and. You're going to have to pick up where a lot of our ancestors left off because they were facing the same problems. They just didn't have Facebook or Instagram to blast them at the speed of light around the planet. And we are the inheritors of that. So we're doing it right now, fam.
Can I just reaffirm what Kevin was saying just very quickly about the logic, which I think is so useful here, is it's basically a quantum logic. Like, we're so used to thinking either or, but it's kind of both and. And I think that if you have that logic in mind, it really helps.
Yes. I mean, I also can say I agree with what has been said. And from where we were starting actually to talk about that, I mean, there is an end where I think it is very crucial to also see that dichotomy that we are in, and that leads us into the tribes, that actually we talk always about Father Sky and Mother Earth, and we have been focusing so much about Father Sky, which is always like a metaphor for our own spirit, and also the earth, it's like the material, it's like our body. And this also really makes a bigger circle to how important the body is, because with the body, we are able to be close to something. With our mind, we can go everywhere. But the body shows to what we are actually connected. And this is something so incredible. The body shows to what we are connected. And the emphasis that we had in the last decades, also because of the internet, made us possible to connect right now through the internet. But the connection that we need to emphasize more is actually like this feminine side, to say, okay, let's look, where is Mother Nature? Where is the body? Where we are connected regionally? What is bodily really the proximity that we have? I mean, even COVID is making this so difficult by all this distancing and so on, to really ask you a question, where do I want to be bodily next to? The most next to that you can find is having sex, but in the everyday life, it is with whom you're going to live, and what's surrounding you, just walking, going, cooking, what is actually what you're eating, all these very material things that has been like a bit, out of balance, and I think there we have like a big, we have to really catch up on that. Our nature is really calling out to say, hey, come on, our bodies are like, okay, we have now so much social distancing, so really saying what we do with our proximity, our connectedness on a regional level. I mean, there are also a lot of initiatives that link regional movements to ecological movements, to like regional economies too. And I think that's only a start, but imagine what happened with the internet, with the connectiveness of our spirit that has grown all over the world, what that could mean to a connectedness to the earth and to our materials, our production of materials, of food, of, yeah. I mean, that could be like as well as distributed as the internet made us possible to be distributed and equally accessible. You know? But this is sometimes really something that I see that there is a collective movement that has to be done. And I relate this so much more to balance the feminine more into the masculine that has been overemphasized in the last decades. And this is just emphasizing like, yeah, gut feelings instead of head, but really finding the balance in the heart. Yeah. I have to put my battery on instead of the slide over here. Hope you see me. Okay.
Excellent. Great. You guys are good to stick around for another question or two?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Cadell and Kevin, I see you both pointing actually at Isaiah's question. So if you want to, Isaiah, do you want to quickly unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I mean, I'll just ask it outright. What role do you guys think that females can play in men's journey to define their own masculinity? And I guess another way of rephrasing it is, how different would the book you guys wrote have been if one of the three was female?
Hey, thanks for your question, Isaiah. I'll sort of answer your questions in a reverse way. So like I'll take the first question as, how would the trilogues be different if one of the voices was female? I'll say for me, I've had a lot of discussions about sexuality. There's a few videos on my YouTube channel where I talk to some women about these topics, and I think that they, in some sense, deserve just as much space, if not more space, in some sort of future project. But I think that for this project, it was really important to keep the trialogues between three men, because I think what I was searching for unconsciously was basically that space among subjects who have experienced a life in a man's body to really express deeply their emotions about that process, and also to make some sort of intellectual sense about that process. And I feel like it probably would have either led to some self-censorship or prohibition on one of our parts if a woman was present. So I think that having three men was good to have that space. But I just want to emphasize that, because I've gotten this impression a number of times where women will feel like because we held a space with three men that we're not open to having spaces with women as well, which is totally not true. I feel like we can have spaces where there's just men talking about sexuality, which is, I think, important. We can have spaces where there's just women talking about sexuality. I think that's important. I think we have to have spaces which are totally blended, androgynous, intersex, and that's important as well. So I think we have to be able to hold all those spaces. And then in terms of what role can or do females play on their journey to define our own masculinity, I feel like my whole sense of self has come from unions and ruptures with the feminine. Like, so I don't even know what I would be without those unions and ruptures. So that's all I have to say. Kevin, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, brilliant, Cadell. I mean, you opened the can there, and to answer that part of the question first, I mean, this is a great question, and I hear this from women all the time who want to support their man or their brother or their partner, etc., really get whole and individuate as a man fully. And the feminine plays a central role, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And again, I talk a lot about these ancient ways and these indigenous ways because that's how the world worked for the first couple million years. What we call modern society is so young and in many ways so naive. And that's just a personal opinion. So you can say that is a naturalistic fallacy. But anyway, all these men, first off, the mother plays a massive role in initiation. The mother is a central figure in a man's initiation and his rise into manhood, because the mother nurtures, gives life, teaches love, and imprints a feminine blueprint into the man's soul, which you might call his anima if you go down the Jungian path or the psychoanalytic path. And the separation with the mother is essential for the man's rising. So he has to detach from codependent ways, energetically and physically, from his mother so he can individuate as a man. Now, the mother can return as an archetype projected onto the female partner, which again, as Cadell was saying, I also have experienced personally, is where much of my masculine identity and maturation has happened, is inside relationship, good and bad, in union and in rupture. And even more so, and Tyson brought this up, which is brilliant, councils of grandmothers. Female elders are essential for masculinity as well. Because where would a man go for healing? Who has knowledge of herbs in a tribe? Who has knowledge of the stories of the ancient ways? The feminine is the holder of that. You can do a lot with the masculine. Some things can only be done with the masculine. So there are rites, rituals. This is why men's circles are going to continue to be a massive force of healing in the coming century. And we've only gotten started with them. Some things you can only do with other men. And that's important because, as Cadell said, the presence of a female will limit, censor, and inhibit certain masculine expression. And the opposite is true for female circles. How open would females be in a red tent or bleeding together during their moon time if a man's present trying to share his feelings about it? I mean, just imagine the correlate, right? Or the opposite. So women are essential to masculine initiation, and it takes many forms. Now, I think this book could only have been written and spoken as it was between 3 men because it's from a masculine perspective. And I think there's a lot of gold in that for men and women. In fact, I think most of the people who reach out to me and say they love the book were female. So that's really interesting to think about. The second thing is, if we did this again in the future, and we are doing it, and when the COVID fuckery has dimmed down, I have a vision, and we've spoken of this, the co-authors, of me, Cadell, and Daniel, with 3 other women who are of similar ilk, having a hexalogue. And let's have a crazy hexalogue where we just hash this out and get into some real tongue twisters philosophically and experientially around the real of sexuality and masculine and feminine meeting. I think if you had 2 men and 1 woman, or 2 women and 1 man as the creators of this, completely different thing. And I don't know if I'd want that. I like the social physics and geometry a certain way. So maybe I'm biased, but curious what you think, Daniel.
Thank you, guys. Well, I also have to say there, I mean, I had very good teachers that have been like male that teach me, yeah, just different things. But actually, when it comes to deep emotional, yeah, really healing and growing, it has been always with a partnership with the feminine, you know, in union and rupture. And that I can't like say thank you to all the women that I have been in union. So I think that's something really very striking, because it is there where the feelings come, where the desire come, where unconscious behavior comes conscious. And when it comes to masculine spaces, it leads back to the question, what if sex wouldn't matter? And that's what happened. We're just honest, open, transparent, because there is no intimate that we have to hide. And this makes another flow. There's nothing that needs to be held back. You know, if we are in a relationship and we have this turmoil of emotions because we love someone, because we fear that we can lose someone, because we might behave wrong, you know, because the other person might not like it, because maybe I don't like myself, because I don't know, and what is the other person going to do, and what is it going to do tomorrow, and if I do that, what does the other person think of me, whatever, you know, all these thoughts that you become insecure about yourself because you care about someone else, and you ask yourself, oh, what I am without this other person, you know. And what I always found, like, and this is like the difficult part with being on a long-term relationship, is really if this communication happens, where you have a mutual understanding and a mutual changing of each other, that you allow also yourself to just accept yourself, you know. So from a role of a feminine, you know, if you just go into this changing of yourself because you uncover unconscious parts of you because you see it in the other, then it is a hard job, but it's like just keeping space, you know. And this leads back to another mirror, because on one hand, the other person is also affected by your changing, you know, and might ask the same questions like, oh my God, he's different. So will he like me again? He changed and things are not the same, and so on. So again, insecurities rises. And so it is, I mean, as long as there's the desire, there is the possibility of change. And when we come to settle down into families and so on, the desire kind of ceases, and the rules and the boys, girls growing up become like more important, but also you stop changing. And that's what's then kicking in when the children are leaving again. So where is your potentiality again to actualize something new? So I do think and believe that on one hand, you have to keep the balance of being accepted as you are. And this is like a very high task if you're confronted with your own emotionality and your own desires. But I think there is more potential to learn in a partnership, but to know about what sex or why sex matters, but it can also lead to change a partnership because you're not attracted anymore. And that means like what you're learning about the other person is not anymore there for your interest or for your attraction. And if we could have a proper way to also have disruption and a union, that would make something really healthy for partnerships. But as long as desire take place and we are desiring and attracting another, which for me it's always a mirror of oneself that we don't know. As long as we don't have these, as long as we have these desires, also we fake it till we make it, that we say, okay, we just meet with mans so we can be open so that sex doesn't matter, so we can be fully conscious. But if you really want to dig the deep unconscious, you look where your desire comes from. So on one hand, we have been looking into the desire by being open amongst men. So this is like the old balance that we had, and also the changes that we experienced by reflecting on these topics. And yeah, I mean, yes, father, mother, I mean, this union is the biggest issue. I mean, these are your first teachers and always to hold sacred. And these are the ones that are actually the ones that always hold space. From a Buddhist tradition, when you're like reborn, that's also that a topic that we mentioned in the book in the last chapter. When you're like reborn, you step into a phase where you're in the middle, and then you get a new illusion where you see a couple having sex. And the one that you feel attracted to, the opposite sex you will become. And in that moment, whoop, you're in the mother, in the womb of the mother. You know? So it is there where the illusion takes place by your desire, actually, that you have of the mother, but you can't have your mother, so the wheel keeps spinning. And actually what you need from a partner is that what you need from your mother, but you won't get it. And as long as we're turning these wheels, there will be desire. Yeah.
Well, you completed that, Daniel, right at precisely the 90-minute mark. Or yeah, that's right. So this might be a good time to close out, but I would invite any final thoughts from the three of you before we do.
I guess the final thoughts, just because it came up so indirectly multiple times, I'll just end by inviting people to think about why we even have sex in the first place. So like Daniel's saying about desire, if you really want to go deep into your desire. And what I always say as a trick is whatever it is you desire the most in a day-to-day way, you know, like Daniel's saying, to ground yourself and like bring yourself back to these day-to-day things. Whenever you desire something, go to the emotion right before the thing you desired. You know, if it's a pizza, whatever, the emotion you have the moment before, and get in touch with that as deeply as you can. I'll just offer the idea that sex obviously is the location where we experience an extremely powerful form of enjoyment, which doesn't seem to be something we can get elsewhere, and that it's simultaneously the location of where we emerge and are reproduce the species. We emerge because two people had sex and a mother held us, and when we have sex, that's the very way in which a new entity, a new human being comes into the world. So sex, in some sense, is a marker of our own finitude, our own mortality. If we were God, we wouldn't need to have sex to reproduce ourselves. The very fact that we are sexual is a marker of our own deepest limitation. So to be able to get in touch with that moment, that emotion, the moment before, is to get in touch with something extremely precious. And all too often when I see people get into relationships, they're unconsciously giving away the most precious part of themselves, just like it's nothing. That's it. That's it.
Taking it deep, Cadell. never disappoints. Yeah, I don't have much to say other than thank you. This is amazing. Shout out to Tyson, my brother, for catalyzing this connection. Again, Daniel, Cadell, always a joy riffing with you. And we had some really great questions in here. You know, all of you that stayed in and got real with us. This has been amazing. Like, this is the kind of stuff societies, communities need to talk about, get to talk about, where we can create this epic new civilization we can all intimate and sense. We all want the same thing. We all want to live in harmony with each other and the earth, and we want to have sex while we're doing it. And that can be with any configuration that you want gender-wise, but I imagine that's something we all share. And if not, you still probably want to be in the community. So let's keep riding the razor edge and moving these issues forward. If we can't talk about it, we can't identify it. If we can't identify it, we can't change it. And if we can't change it, then, well, we're going to repeat what the past generations did in the negative way. We want to repeat what they did in a positive way and new. As Jung said, we want old wine and new wineskins. And that's really where my mind goes and my heart goes, and why I'm motivated to speak and why I'm motivated to do this work. And again, if y'all want to check out the book, it's sexmasculinityGod.com. It's on Amazon right now, paperback, and we're going to have a Kindle version coming out soon. So please hop on the newsletter through the website if you guys are more of a Kindle digital version. And maybe potentially an audiobook too. We'll re-record the audio in a new way. I think that's exciting. A lot of people have asked me about that. So bowing out, appreciate y'all.
Thank you all for participating and drawing out also these questions. I also can emphasize what Cadell said, like take it into your everyday experience, like ask yourself, why I am desiring what I'm desiring. As soon as you rise to the consciousness, you're already changing it, you know. So on one hand, there is a way to really raise consciousness, and then you are becoming really limitless. Because, and this is what I can go back into what we said about communities and partnership, you know, that we have like this entity that we want to hold on, and we say, okay, we limit ourselves to one partner, we limit ourselves to one community, you know, that won't work anymore. So that when we watch at our desires, we will find limitlessness. But that's really personal work. And in here, masculinity circles, but also the way how you engage with partners is so valuable to really establish a new way of society, you know, that is not bound on our instinctive feelings of sexuality, but on a conscious way. And yeah, keep it up, and I hope to see you soon somewhere.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Tyson, for making this possible.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tyson.
Yeah, my pleasure. I really enjoyed this and appreciate you for bringing the conversation and making these closing invitations. I'll close with 2 invitations. One is, of course, to get the book, Sex, Masculinity, God, if you are interested in diving deeper in this subject. And the link is there. And also to join us on Election Day at the STOA for it's maybe not the end of the world election party. You can engage in some stoic hustle, some stoic breath work, collective presencing, and a variety of other things, Socratic speed dating, rap on battles. So Election Day, join us for a party. And you can find that, of course, at thestoa.ca. All right. Peace and love, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.